Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance for our program is provided by the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing. Today on Oklahoma Gardening, host Casey Hentges is out in the garden scratching trunks and stems to see what has overwintered. We plant a salsa garden in a container. OSU Turfgrass Specialist Dennis Martin looks at shade grasses. Casey has a fun plant for the water garden. And Payne County Extension Horticulturist Keith Reed has tips on protecting against late frosts.
Many times this time of year, we're often looking and anticipating for those dormant plants to start breaking bud and come out of that dormancy. And sometimes some plants can take a little bit longer than we anticipated. We anxiously wait and wonder, are they still alive and are they going to come back? Well, I want to show you a simple and easy way to find out if that plant is still alive. And it doesn't really do any harm to the plant at all. I tend to find myself doing this a little bit because I'm wanting to rush spring sometimes. But what you can do is it's called a scratch test, and it's really simple. You can sometimes do it with your fingernail if you have a sharp fingernail, and depending on how thick the bark is. But what you're going to do is just basically scratch the outside layer of the wood a little bit. And if you notice here on this particular branch, it's just kind of white. It was pretty rough, it didn't feel very wet, there was not much to it. So I have a feeling that this branch right here doesn't have much life to it. Now just because you find something that doesn't appear to be alive, that doesn't mean this whole plant is dead, okay? So what we're gonna do is go down to the base of the plant and scratch the base of the wood just slightly. And there you can see that we've got some green exposed cambium, and that cambium layer is basically what's showing that there is still life in this plant. So if you see green anywhere on the plant, then you know that plant still has life to it. Just because you see a little dead doesn't mean the whole plant is dead. Now on this particular plant, this is a vitex or a chase tree, and so it's got several different branches. Now each one of these branches might represent something, but we know that for the most part this plant is still alive. If you have a single solitary tree, you would want to scratch the base of it to really identify whether that whole plant is alive. Again, if the top part is showing no green, that doesn't mean the base of it is not still alive. And when you do this, you want to make sure that you're just nicking the wood. You don't want to encircle by scoring it all the way around, but just slightly nick the wood to expose that green cambium layer. Now you want to be cautious on something that's grafted. A lot of times the stem might appear that it doesn't have any green and not be viable, but you might still see shoots coming up from the base of it. And that's often because the scion or the grafted wood might have died back, but the rootstock is actually growing back. And in that case, you're going to have a plant growing there, but it might not be the plant that you intended that has the quality of that upper grafted growth. Salsa is one of our favorite condiments, and homemade salsa is even better. After all, we can control the texture of it, the flavor of it, and most importantly, the heat of it. But in addition to being able to make homemade salsa with the produce that you might buy at the grocery store, you can even control it even further if you were to buy the plants that you might use in order to grow that produce yourself. So today we're going to build or create a salsa garden. And it's pretty simple. All you need to do is plant a tomato plant, a pepper plant, and some cilantro. Now, if you have onions, you might want to think about using those onions, but if you didn't plant onions, you can also use some onion chives just to get that flavor in there. So we're going to start out by planting our tomato because this is going to be the biggest plant that we put in there. I would recommend maybe looking at finding a determinate tomato and maybe even one that's a patio type tomato that's going to stay relatively small if you're doing it in a container. Now, of course, you can plant these same sort of plants just in your garden and harvest them and use those to make salsa as well. But here we just have a traditional kind of saucer container, nothing fancy about it. You do want to make sure there's a drainage hole in it so that it does drain. I would recommend that the bigger the container, the less you'll have to water it once it's established. So we've got our tomato plant here. You can see it's got some nice roots on it. If you see a lot of roots that are circling, you're going to want to tease those a little bit so that that allows those roots to go out into the soil once it's planted. Now, the thing about planting a tomato, and this is unique to tomatoes, is that you can actually plant them deeper than what you would plant other plants. Traditionally, we say let's plant it at the soil line that it was planted at in the pot, but with tomatoes you can actually take off those lower stems and plant them even deeper. This is just going to prevent it from blowing over, and it's going to allow it to develop a bigger root system in that pot. So your arrangement on making a salsa container garden might vary. I've kind of put my tomato a little bit to the center but off to one side as well because over here I'm going to plant my pepper plant. Now this is a hot jalapeno plant, and I'm just going to squeeze that container and I let it just fall out onto my hand. I don't pull it because if I break the stem, then I've kind of killed that plant. So we just let it fall out onto your hand. Again, we have some circling roots that we're going to tease apart there. And then we're going to plant this in that soil. Now with peppers, you want to maintain that soil line. You don't want to bury it any deeper. So make sure that it's going in at the same depth. So we've got our tomato, we've got our pepper. Now we're just going to fill in with our cilantro. And we have here our traditional cilantro. It's the flat leaf. It looks like flat leaf parsley a little bit, but it definitely smells and tastes like cilantro. Some people don't want this in their salsa. So again, by doing this at home, you can choose whether you want to add it or not to your garden. We also have a different type of cilantro here that I want to show. This is called confetti cilantro, and it just has a little bit more of a cut leaf to it, fern-like leaf to it. And I'm a little bit curious about growing this. I would imagine that when you're going to make your salsa, it's sort of chopped up more finely for you already, straight out of the garden. Plus, the texture is just going to be really nice in this pot. So you can see it's got some good roots on it there. We're just going to kind of break those apart and plant that in the side here. So again, if you didn't plant onions in February, you might add that onion flavor by getting some onion chives. Again, it's got a nice fine foliage to it to add some contrast to the broad foliage of the pepper and the tomato. We've got some good roots in here, so we're just going to put that in our pot. Now, you notice when I started, I had this probably 2/3 of the way full of soil. I planted the tomato, but these others, I've kind of just left them exposed a little bit. So at this point, I'm going to go in and fill with some more potting soil around those plants to bring that soil line up. So here you can see it's a nice, easy container garden, one that you could put on your patio, or a great way to introduce gardening to kids or to yourself if you're starting out. Plus, you're going to get an edible product at the end of it. Now that we've got it all planted, again, we only planted our tomato a little bit deeper. The rest are buried at the same height that they were in the container. You can see we've left a little bit of lip on the container between that and the soil line, and that's so that we can water it without it washing away.
We're in early March taking a look at the 2017 NTEP Kentucky Bluegrass Trial. Now, even though it's entitled the 2017 NTEP Kentucky Bluegrass Trial, it wasn't planted until spring of 2018, so we're 2 years of maturity now in this trial. In early March, there's a lot of things to see in this trial. Quite notably, the tremendous differences in earliness of spring green-up. Some of that is genetic and some of it is due to leaf spot disease, which delays the green-up of some of the varieties. For instance, the variety that I'm standing on right here. A lot of brown leaves are very visible. This can be improved through a light scalping of the grass and taking off some of the dead tissue that without going too low of a height to cut. That'll give a much nicer appearance. But there are tremendous differences in green up between some varieties here, this one being delayed, and then also the one that's in the foreground. Also, some of the other things that we'd like to point out is choice in terms of reseeding damaged areas of turf grasses. This goes for not only Kentucky bluegrasses, but also perennial ryegrasses and tall fescues. The best time to overseed for damage that was caused in the summer of the year is in the fall of the year. That's the first choice. The second best choice is to do it in the spring, but if you wait until the spring, there's a tremendous compromise in some cases. What we see here in this Kentucky Bluegrass trial is injury from summer patch disease. That's a very serious disease that kills the crowns, and therefore you get a great opening in the stand, and it allows summer annual weeds like crabgrass and goosegrass to come in, and then those are killed by the frosts in the fall, leaving you with an ugly tan cover in this open area. Now, by not overseeding in the fall, and if we try to do it in the spring, we've got a challenge ahead of us. First of all, as everyone should know, when we cast out seed of a desirable variety, the pre-emergent herbicide doesn't know that it's not supposed to control the germination of the desirable turf grass as opposed to controlling the germination of the weed. So there's a compromise there. If we seed now in the spring to thicken up these areas of bluegrass that was killed out, we won't be able to use a pre-emergent herbicide because that would inhibit the germination of the Kentucky bluegrass. So we might fill that in with reseeding, but we're going to face some seed germination of goosegrass and perhaps yellow foxtail and crabgrass as well. Now, if we choose to put the pre-emergent down, then we don't overseed, we don't face the weed, but we face an open bare area of soil. So that's the problem with choosing a pre-emergent versus a spring seeding. You have to choose one or the other, and that's why fall overseeding of cool season perennial grasses is the best time to seed. We're now at 2 years of maturity on this National Turfgrass Evaluation Program Tall Fescue trial. And this variety here is not one of the best in that it was attacked by large brown patch fungal disease last year. And you can actually even see some annual bluegrass, a winter annual cool season grass that came into the area that was opened up from the disease. Now, the tall fescue that was in there and that was hit by the disease has long since rotted away after it died, but it's left these ugly openings. And we talk about tall fescue being a bunch type grass. It doesn't have the ability to knit in like Bermuda grass when it is injured. So we'd have to cast seed over the area and get it to germinate to fill in these types of damaged areas. Much like the situation with Kentucky bluegrass as a cool season perennial, you have to make the choice of seeding in the fall or the spring. And fall, again, is the first best choice for reseeding a damaged area like this. And that's because we find ourselves in the spring, if we choose to seed now, we can't use a pre-emergent herbicide. If we use the pre-emergent herbicide and we don't overseed or interseed, then we've got this ugly open area that we may have to tolerate for the next 8 months till we get the best option for seeding again. So again, it's a chance to look at why we do fall interseeding rather than spring. The other thing that I like to always mention when we talk about cool season perennial grasses is the reason that we suggest mixing tall fescues with Kentucky bluegrasses. That sometimes helps in cross resistance to the diseases. Tall fescues have good resistance to summer patch disease, but they're weak in terms of their resistance to large brown patch fungal disease. And on the flip side, Kentucky bluegrasses are much more resistant to brown patch fungal disease, but susceptible to summer patch. So that's why we mix them. And in order to get a 1-to-1 approximate seed count, we'll frequently use 95% by weight tall fescue and about 5% by weight Kentucky bluegrass. And that's because there's about a 10-fold difference in the size of the seed. And then that would yield, on a seed count basis, a 1-to-1 ratio if by weight you have 95% tall fescue and 5% Kentucky bluegrasses. So think about these very important factors when you go to reestablish your cool season perennial lawn.
COVID-19 is affecting many of us, and just like you, we are practicing social distancing, and most of my days are being spent at home working while also juggling 2 kids and trying to just find a new normal. I know many kids are out of school nowadays, and we're all trying to find activities to keep them off of the screen. That's why daily we're going to be posting kids activity on our Facebook channel. So join us daily to find out what activity you can do with your kids in the backyard or maybe even in the house related to gardening. Many of these activities are posted on our YouTube channel already. They were pre-recorded before social distancing was a thing. So we're going to regularly be posting on Facebook resources for gardeners as well. I know some of you might be new to gardening and just starting to look at your backyard about what you can do. So if you're new to gardening, we'll have plenty of resources to help you figure out how to get a garden started, because this is a prime opportunity to do it. If you're very well versed in gardening and familiar with it, we would also suggest that you still join us on Facebook, because we're going to be posting many resources and fact sheets that might be timely and good reminders for you as we go through this season. As we go over the next few weeks and as you start doing activities and garden projects, we'd love to hear about what you're doing. Please share with us photos or tell us what you're doing in your garden or with your kids. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to post those. We'd love to be able to respond to those. While we might not all be practicing our normal routine, it's important that we stay socially engaged with one another, and Facebook is one of those great ways of doing that. Above all, we hope that you stay well and stay healthy. Kids love water, and water gardening is a fun way to get kids out into the garden. You can see that a water garden is composed of a lot of different elements, with the water and the plants and the fish. So it's also a great way to teach them about ecosystems. Now, in order to have a water garden, you're going to want to incorporate a couple of different plants. And plants that like to live in the water live at different depths. Some will go all the way to the bottom of the pond, and some live on the edge that are known as bog plants. One bog plant that we want to introduce to you today is called the sensitive plant. Now, this particular plant is fun for kids because it's got this mimosa-like foliage that when you touch it, it closes up. You can see how those leaves kind of fold up on themselves. Because the foliage closes up when it's disturbed, the plant doesn't actually do well up next to splashing water or if your creek is running too quickly, because that water will cause those leaves to always be folded, which will reduce the amount of photosynthesis that plant can do, therefore reduce the actual production of energy, and that plant won't thrive as well. You want to make sure to put your sensitive plant in an area where it's not going to be disturbed as much, other than by some of those kiddos that might be enjoying playing with it. Now, you can see the sensitive plant, while it's planted in a container and the roots are in the water, the plant itself will actually spread across the surface of the water. And it does that with these roots that kind of hang from the plant, and it almost has a spongy-like material that is on the plant. That's a special cell that actually helps the plant float along that surface. Now this plant will often creep along the surface of the pond and sometimes up into the creek bed if it's a slow moving creek. And what's nice is it actually provides a lot of cover and shelter for your fish below when there might be predators around. Now this particular sensitive plant has a kind of a yellow puff to it, but you can see that it's really grown more for the foliage than the flower itself. There's also another plant called a giant sensitive plant, which will spread up to 8 feet across in diameter, and it has more of a yellow sweet pea-like flower to it. Again, mainly grown for its foliage. These are tropical plants, so they're going to die in the winter if we don't bring them in. On this particular one, you can easily take a little cutting off of this and bring in just the start of that plant if you wanted to overwinter it. You can see, even though it's an annual, you're going to get quite a bit of growth throughout the season as those pond temperatures warm up. Sensitive plant is a fun water garden plant you might try to encourage your kids to get out and garden.
Today we actually have two goals with this segment. First of all, to be honest with you, I want to invite you into my meager garden so you'll feel better about your own efforts. So you're welcome for that. Second to that, I want to show you a little trick that I use for season extension. This idea of getting an early start in the springtime and extending our growing season into the fall to help us deal with our erratic weather patterns. And you know, there are a lot of tools to do that, and some of them are quite pricey, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I want to show you a couple examples of that today. So I have some old storm windows here, and then I've got some old storm windows over there that I've accumulated through the years. And then here are my beds. I've just designed these beds to fit my storm windows. And so I've adjusted my gardening to work for the materials I have on hand. So let me show you what I've done here. Okay, so obviously things have grown since I last needed this including adding the little trellis there. So originally the other windows would have made this double this length. But all I've done is simply taken these old storm windows and I've made a little very crude cold frame for them. And here I can take I had some old styrofoam on hand, so I put that on the ends, and boom, there I am. I have a mini greenhouse. So I actually planted these vegetables in the last week of January. So they've encountered several cold snaps we've had, and as you can see, they're doing quite well. Of course, the thing about doing something like this is you have to always be able to adjust no matter what the weather conditions are doing. For example, it could be 20 degrees at night, and then we have a bright sunny day, which of course things would burn up. So you have to be prepared to micromanage these, in some cases a couple of times a day, depending on what the weather's doing. And then over here is just another example where this looks like a raised bed, but I've shaped it in such a way that it works for those big windows back there. So I simply set those in place as needed, and if it's chilly but not too cold, I just raise them up and stick a stick or a brick under them or something, and so I can get some temperature regulation. But as you can see, the onions are doing good. The carrots are starting to come on. We've got spinach that's taking off. So I'm very pleased with that. So once again, you see ideas and concepts. Think about materials that maybe you have on hand that would already work for the purpose. They might not look exactly right, but as far as functionality, they'll serve the purpose. And I wish you the best of luck this gardening season.
For many people in the horticulture industry, a big portion of their business relies on these spring sales. I just want to remind you, spring isn't canceled, and many greenhouses and nurseries are full of beautiful plants that are looking for a good home. If you are a gardener and wanting to get plants, I would encourage you to reach out to your local nursery and greenhouse to find out how you can still get those plants. Many of them are getting creative about how to get you those plants in safe ways.
Next week, we'll see how fire is used for good land management in an urban area. Casey will lash sticks together. Keith Reed will be back to help protect against hot temperatures. Casey invests in the future with an asparagus planting. And Barbara Brown will help us create a nutritious casserole from whatever we have in the pantry. We wish you health and wellness, and we'll see you next week for more Oklahoma gardening. To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We would like to thank our generous underwriter, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is also provided by Pond Pro Shop, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, the Oklahoma Horticultural Society, and the Tulsa Garden Club.